Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Psalm 92, verse 2. This verse has served as a theme for our series of lessons on worship. And as we continue this study, today let's consider the day of worship. Now, of course, in the Old Testament, we have a special emphasis upon the Sabbath day. Picking up in Genesis 2, verse 3, So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. The book of Genesis opens with the description of God creating everything in the course of 6 days. And following these 6 days of creation, on the seventh day he rested. The text says that he blessed the seventh day. He made it holy. It was set apart because on that day God had completed, he was finished with his work of creation. This, of course, made the seventh day holy even before the law of Moses. But in the law of Moses, we find a specific reference to this. Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We, of course, recognize that the 6 days of creation, on this basis, should be understood as a literal 6 days, because the seventh day is considered a literal seventh day. God made the world in 6 days. On the seventh day he rested. In the law of Moses, this is brought into focus with the commandment to not work, to not labor on the seventh day. What we would refer to as Saturday is the Sabbath, the day that is set apart. Now, when we look at this, we find, interestingly, in the law of Moses, absolutely nothing in reference to worship on the seventh day. The Sabbath day was not a day of worship. Specifically, the Levitical services, the tabernacle and temple services were going on at other times. The Sabbath day was a day set apart. Presumably, it would be a time of contemplation, perhaps of study, of religious instruction, but nothing is spelled out other than the prohibition of work. Later in the Old Testament, we find that the Jews went off into captivity, and seemingly this is where the synagogue came into existence. In Luke 4:16, we read about Jesus being in the synagogue. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and was his custom he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. It was his custom to go to the synagogue, the place of assembly. The term synagogue just simply means to study together, to learn together. And so it is that the Jews, before the time of Christ, had begun the custom of establishing schools, places for religious instruction, synagogues. And these synagogues became very important, and especially after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, they became the focus of Jewish life. These were not commanded in the law of Moses, but they fulfilled the underlying command to study, to be reverent, to be in association with God's people, and to worship. We must be very careful, though, whenever we look at the idea of the Sabbath, not to bring together the prohibitions of work and the active command to worship. The Sabbath, as given in the law of Moses, was not a time of worship, but rather a time that simply set God's people apart as holy. It was a time of rest. Christians are not under any obligation to observe a Sabbath, that is to say, a day of rest, any more than we are under obligation to observe any of the law of Moses. Colossians 2:16 makes it clear. Paul says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath." In the Lord's church, we must be very careful not to add to what God has commanded. For that reason, we should not have unauthorized holy days. Every Lord's Day, every Sunday, is holy to God. But we are not commanded in the New Testament to abstain from work on Sunday. Nowhere is that intimated. In fact, whenever we look at the situation of early Christians, many of them, in fact, a majority of them, would have been servants, would have been slaves. They didn't get a day off. They worshiped largely in the evenings for that very reason. The prohibition of work that was part of the Mosaic law is not carried over into the New Testament. No one should enjoin this on someone else. But let's consider the first day of the week. As with so many things, we need balance. No, we should not be overly restrictive and place burdens on people, prohibiting work and placing regulations that God never gave for the first day of the week. But on the other hand, we should recognize that the first day of the week is a special day. It is the day of Christian worship in a very special sense. Christians are privileged to worship on any day of the week. And yet there are things that are only authorized by example or by command for the first day of the week. But let's consider the importance of the first day of the week. It is the day of the resurrection. Our Savior was crucified and spent 3 days in the tomb. But then, on the third day, the first day of the week, he was resurrected. Matthew 28, beginning in verse 1, we read, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. He is not here, he is risen. The Lord is risen.' And it was on the first day of the week, the day of resurrection. We find also the first day of the week figures prominently after the resurrection. There were special appearances of Jesus that John in his gospel notes in a very particular way occurred on the first day of the week. Why should that particular detail be given? It's given because the first day of the week is a special day. John 20, verse 19, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' Jesus gave them the traditional greeting of peace, shalom. And having appeared to them in a miraculous way, They were in a locked room, and all at once he was there. It was on the first day of the week. And then 8 days later, in other words, on the next first day of the week, we have another appearance. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." So the Gospel of John, in these two references in chapter 20, show us that the first day of the week was a day where the disciples were together. And on these two first days of the week, 1 week apart, Jesus appeared to his disciples. We find also the disciples were gathered together on the first day of the week for the day of Pentecost. They gathered in an upper room, and the Holy Spirit came upon them. Acts chapter 2 begins, "When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place." The day of Pentecost, it's a Jewish festival, and it always falls on the first day of a week. The first day of the week is the day of Pentecost. It occurs in our month of June. But when we think in terms of Pentecost, the birth of the church, it is a special day, and it was a first day of the week. We find the Lord's Supper was observed on the first day of the week. This is by example. In Acts 20, verse 7, we read, "On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread." The Apostle Paul had arrived in town, but he delayed departing until he could meet with the disciples on the first day of the week. He then would preach to them in this time of assembly. But their gathering was for the purpose of the Lord's Supper. They gathered together for the breaking of bread. We must be very clear that this example of observing the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day is the only example we have. And for that reason, we are not authorized to observe the Lord's Supper on any day of the week, but only on the first day. Even more specific is the statement regarding the contribution. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper. This statement from 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, shows us in Paul's command, first of all, that the Lord's church gathered on the first day of every week, but also the direct command to lay aside something at that time. Certainly Christians are privileged to give to God at any time, but there's a special sense in which the first day of every week is specified as a time of giving, as an act of worship. And then we think in terms of the expression, the Lord's Day. This is the day of resurrection. This is the day where the gospel came into effect. It's the day the gospel was proclaimed on the day of Pentecost. And so it was, the Apostle John uses this expression in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 10. "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet." So it is, the revelation that John received was given on the Lord's Day, that is to say, on the first day of the week. We need to have balance in considering the Lord's Day, recognizing that it is holy, it is set apart, it is special, but we must not include in this reverence anything that is unauthorized. We cannot prohibit people from doing work on the Lord's Day, but we must encourage every Christian to assemble together, to come together, and if you're involved in some work that prevents that, you should weigh very carefully what you are doing. We should not neglect to assemble together. We are to come together as the church. The Apostle Paul corrected many abuses in the church of Corinth, abuses concerning worship. And as you read through those instructions, it becomes clear that the church was to come together as the church. There's a sense in which, when we gather together, we are the Lord's body, in a sense that we are not when we are separate from one another. Religion, as we've seen before, may be either man-centered or God-centered. Keeping focused on God helps us to correctly balance what we should be doing on the Lord's Day. God should be worshiped according to His Word. Now, He has given us many commands and examples. He's given us precepts. But in much of this, we must make application, but we're responsible for how we apply these principles. Worship is intentional. There should be a plan for what we are doing, and it is to be purposeful. We should intend to do what God has commanded, and we should find the most expedient ways to do these things. Worship is defined by God. He is the one whom we worship, and in worshiping Him in spirit and in truth, we are able to be the church that God has called us to be. We are to worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Thank you so much for joining me for this class. I look forward to seeing you again soon.